Chapter 6 focuses on the trait approach to personality. This approach recognizes that no two individuals behave, think, or feel exactly the same way. Everyday language contains many words to describe these differences. The trait approach to personality psychology builds on this intuition by translating the natural, informal language of personality into a formal psychology that measures traits and uses them to predict and explain human behavior. Traits are a language for a way to conceptualize and measure patterns of individual differences that are already there. It doesn't look at universal processes like love, and it doesn't take the perspective that each person is so unique they can't be meaningfully compared with anyone else. The trait approach is based on the presumption that all people are like some other people, and that it's meaningful and useful to assess broad categories of individual differences. Measuring traits has two important purposes. One, to predict behavior, and two, to understand behavior. So we're going to look at the research that examines how traits and behavior are connected. The body of research that we're going to review uses 4 basic approaches. We're going to focus on 3 of these approaches. First one is the single trait approach. This one focuses on one especially important trait and studies how this one trait leads to many different outcomes. The second approach we'll talk about is the many trait approach. This focuses on a particular behavior or outcome and asks, what kind of people do that thing? What personality traits are associated with this one behavior, in other words? The third approach is the essential trait approach, and this seeks to identify and study the traits that researchers think can be used to identify everyone in some way. Let's start with the single trait approach, which examines the link between personality and behavior by asking, what do people like X do, with X being some important personality trait? Some traits have seemed so important that psychologists have devoted a major amount of effort to assessing as many of their implications as possible. For example, quite a bit of attention has been paid to traits like self-monitoring and narcissism. Self-monitoring is the degree to which inner and outer selves and behaviors are the same or different across situations. People who are high self-monitors have discrepant selves and behaviors. They look for cues in every situation that signal how to act, and they adjust their behavior for that situation. Low self-monitors have similar selves and behaviors. In other words, these people are largely the same outside as they are inside and don't really vary across situations. It's not necessarily better to be high or low. Both poles have positive and negative implications and correlates. For example, high self-monitors can be described as adaptable, flexible, and sensitive, or they can be described as wishy-washy, two-faced, and lacking integrity. Low self-monitors can be described as self-directed, having integrity, and being honest, but they can also be seen as being insensitive, inflexible, and stubborn. The degree of self-monitoring correlates with several behaviors. High self-monitors compared to low self-monitors show better performance in job interviews, greater willingness to lie to get a date. They use more strategies to influence their coworkers as well. If you aren't sure whether you're high or low, you could consider completing the self-monitoring questionnaire, which is available on iLearn or in your textbook on page 183. Narcissism is defined as excessive self-love. People high in narcissism have been described by people who know them well as being generally manipulative, overbearing, and vain. Research has found that being high in this trait is associated with many negative behaviors and attributes. Acting aggressively when their positive self-view is threatened, not handling failure very well. Individuals who are high in narcissism are also known to argue and swear a lot. Why do they act like this? It's presumed that they're attempting to defend unrealistically inflated self-concept. So general failure to control impulses and to delay gratification are also part of this profile. Not all of narcissism is bad, however. Narcissists are high on leadership and authority, and they have higher self-confidence. They are more charismatic and popular, and report greater life satisfaction. The many-trait approach looks at many traits in relation to one behavior, compared to the single-trait approach, which we were just talking about. Allport and his colleagues led the charge in 1936 when they came up with a list of over 17,000 trait words. And Wood and colleagues narrowed this down to 504 traits clumped into 61 clusters. Funder's favorite is the 100-trait California Q-set, though it isn't really 100 traits but 100 descriptions, each of which is more complex than a single word trait. The California Q-set is a test that's completed by a person either assessing themselves or assessing an acquaintance. The task is to identify only a few descriptors as being the most important for characterizing that particular person. Some examples of items in the Q-set are things like is very unpredictable and changeable in behavior and attitudes. Another one is vulnerable to real or fancied threat, generally fearful, is a talkative individual. These are all of the different descriptors that are in the California Q-set. And this is what the Q-sort looks like. People are given the 100 cards, or they do it on a computer. Each has the description on it, and they need to sort it using this kind of distribution, where if the trait doesn't necessarily characterize somebody but doesn't necessarily not characterize them, then that trait is categorized in the middle column. Those traits that are extremely characteristic of a person go all the way to the right, and those traits that are extremely uncharacteristic of a person go to the left. There's an important advantage of Q-sorting and taking a many-trait approach in that it forces the judge to compare, whether the judge is judging themselves or someone else. They're comparing a lot of items directly against each other within one individual, rather than making a relative comparison across individuals. Also, the person doing the rating is restricted to identifying only a very few items that are critical for characterizing a particular person. Some of the research looking at the many-trait approach has focused on patterns of word use. So certainty words include words like absolutely, exact, truly. What are some personality traits that might relate to this pattern of word use? Are people who use a lot of certainty words more confident and secure, or are they actually more insecure? There was a study conducted where they used a life history interview and then had the answers transcribed and analyzed by a program called the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count program. And it calculated the number of words that appeared in a list of categories, including this category of certainty words. It was found that people who used a relatively large number of certainty words were described by their friends as being more intelligent, verbally fluent, someone to turn to for advice, ambitious, and generous. People who rarely use certainty words were more likely to be described as emotionally bland and creating and exploiting dependence. There's been some longitudinal research looking at the association between multiple traits earlier in life and outcomes later in life. So depression can be predicted by a number of traits earlier in life. For girls, being described as shy, over-socialized, self-punishing, and over-controlled at age 7 was a significant predictor of being diagnosed with depression at age 18. For boys, being described as unsocialized, aggressive, and under-controlled earlier in life related to diagnosis of depression at age 18. The third approach is the essential trait approach. This approach asks the question, which traits are the most important? Which traits really matter? Which traits can be used to categorize everyone as either high or low? There have been many theoretical approaches to reducing all of the trait words to very few. Henry Murray hypothesized that there were these 20 needs that we all have. Block and Block proposed that individuals could be categorized based on just two traits, ego control and ego resiliency. Ego control means impulse control. Ego resiliency refers to psychological adjustment or how flexible one is. Factor analytic approaches have been used to reduce the idea of many traits into fewer traits. This is a statistical approach that looks at the correlations between many variables and tries to identify whether there are latent factors underneath that can account for the association between these many variables. Cattell used this approach and found 16 essential traits, things like friendliness, intelligence, dominance. Recently, people have said this is way too many. Tellegen suggested there were 3: positive emotionality, negative emotionality, and constraint. These 3 aspects are actually pretty often used to describe temperament, which is just personality in children. Eysenck's PEN model is one of the more common models and is highly similar to Tellegen's positive emotionality, negative emotionality, and constraint. Eysenck's model describes 3 fundamental constitutional differences between people, and he called these broad psychological dimensions superfactors. And let's look at these factors. So one of the superfactors that Eysenck identified was extroversion. The facets of this, or the traits of extroversion, would be things like sociable, lively, carefree, dominant. The second superfactor he identified was neuroticism. And the traits or the subfacets of neuroticism he identified were anxiety, low self-esteem, shyness. Finally, he proposed psychoticism as the third superfactor. This factor is said to reflect things like aggressiveness, lack of empathy, creativity, and being tough-minded. This 3 superfactor model led to the discovery of the Big Five. Researchers got together and they formed this lexical hypothesis. The idea that important aspects of life will be labeled with words, and if something is truly important and universal, there will be many words for it in all languages. So those searching for the Big Five were looking for how words could cluster together in a universal way to reflect a certain essential trait. And this work also used factor analysis. What they found was that 5 personality traits could identify most people. In this model, the traits are orthogonal, which means that theoretically they should not be related to one another. Somebody can be high on multiple traits or low on multiple traits. What level somebody is on one trait shouldn't have any impact on how they are on another trait. The nice thing about this is it brings order to many research findings. However, it's way more complex than the model seemed at first. Once they started examining the factors that were coming up, the 5 factors, which we'll discuss in detail in a minute, they realized that they're not entirely orthogonal, and that these 5 factors might actually represent 2 higher order factors of stability and plasticity, or there might be more lower order factors than just these 5 factors, and that the labels that they came up with might be oversimplified. So the first of the Big Five is extroversion. Extroversion is similar to what Eysenck had proposed. It's this idea of a trait that reflects warmth and gregariousness. Individuals who are extroverts react less to sensory stimuli and yet are highly sensitive to rewards. Some advantages of being high on this trait include higher status, being rated as more popular and physically attractive, and it's associated with more positive emotions. There are disadvantages to extroversion, however. It's been correlated with more argumentativeness, a greater need to be in control, and poor time management. The second of the Big Five is neuroticism, also known as emotional instability or negative emotionality. Neuroticism is a cluster of traits that include anxiety, depression, impulsivity, and vulnerability to stress. High levels of neuroticism has been associated with ineffective problem solving, greater sensitivity to social threats. It's negatively correlated with happiness, well-being, and physical health. Unfortunately, high neuroticism is a disadvantage in that there's a general tendency toward psychopathology and mental illness. Conscientiousness is the third of the big five. Conscientiousness includes things like competence, order, dutifulness. You'll notice that this was not one of the three factors that Eysenck came up with. Conscientiousness predicts success in college better than SATs or GPAs, actually. There is a theory that conscientious might explain motivation in general. People who are conscientious are also more likely to feel guilty, especially when they don't meet expectations. Conscientiousness predicts longer life expectancy, and it's also positively correlated with years of schooling. Agreeableness is the fourth factor, again, another factor that Eysenck did not identify in his three-factor model. Agreeableness reflects being cooperative and easy to get along with, highly likable, being warm. Women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men, and people who are agreeable tend to rate others more positively. Agreeableness has been associated with a number of life outcomes, including more psychologically well-adjusted, healthier heart, and being involved in religious activities. Openness to experience is the most controversial trait. It is said to reflect being creative, imaginative, and artistic. People view others who are high in openness as being more open-minded and clever, but also politically liberal and more likely to believe in astrology and ghosts. Openness to experience has been associated with greater drug use and also greater involvement in the arts. Other ways to think about this trait is maybe how people tend to approach intellectual matters, or how much people value cultural diversity or creativity. This trait is controversial because it has not been replicated across all samples and cultures. Several attempts have been made to see whether the Big Five can be found outside of weird countries. As you'll remember, weird means westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. There is some evidence that personality questionnaires translated into various languages yield at least 4 of the 5 factors. Like I said, openness is not replicated across countries, but the other 4 factors have been, especially in the Philippines, Japan, and China. It's also interesting to think about the universality of the Big Five just in the U.S. There have been some very cool studies, one of which I posted for you to read if you're interested, looking at the U.S. and where high levels of the Big Five cluster geographically. We can take a look at that here. Extroversion, as you'll see, is highest in the central part of the country and lowest in the Northeast and East Coast. What is the most outgoing state? It is North Dakota, actually. In terms of agreeableness, highest is the Midwest and parts of the South, and the lowest is the Northeast. Neuroticism is highest in the type A states, like all of New England. Also high in states with very high poverty rates, like West Virginia and Mississippi. Neuroticism is lowest in the western states. Conscientiousness is highest in southern and Midwest states, who also have the highest level of mathematicians, which is interesting. Conscientiousness is surprisingly lowest in the Northeast. I say surprising because the Northeast has the greatest cluster of Ivy League colleges. Openness, perhaps not surprising to you all, is highest in the West Coast and also the Northeast states. It's lowest in the Midwest and in southern states. We'll end here with the major criticisms of the Big Five model. Other researchers have argued that there's more to personality than these 5 traits. One researcher, for example, found evidence for a 6-factor model and labeled them Hexaco. It's basically the same 5 factors with the additional factor of humility and honesty as the 6th major trait. Others have found even more factors, including seductiveness, manipulativeness, integrity, and religiosity. Another criticism of the Big Five is that it's too broad for conceptual understanding. Trying to characterize other traits like narcissism as combinations of Big Five traits often leaves out important concepts. In other words, technically, you could describe narcissism as high extroversion, low conscientiousness, low openness, and low agreeableness, but really, all of that collection misses the very essence of the trait. Despite these criticisms, the Big Five has been used in countless personality studies and will come up again and again in the other modules.